Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hey, my name is Jake Williams. I'm here from Rendition InfoSec. Wanted to actually walk through an interesting legal filing that was brought to my attention this morning by Suchi Pahi. It's a Cyber Jedi on Twitter. She's an outstanding lawyer, not your lawyer, not my lawyer, but certainly an outstanding cyber smart lawyer. Which many more are needed. This is actually a really interesting cyber insurance case, and if you're anything like me and you work in information security, you've probably heard a lot about cyber insurance, what it's good for, what it's not good for, all that stuff, right? And so, this is a great case to walk through with executives. Again, this probably is a better, actually, as I say, case to walk through with your executives. If you're not a lawyer, you should take it to probably one of yours. I should also caveat that I am not a lawyer, but definitely have an interest on the legal side, particularly when it comes to cyber insurance. Right, served as an expert witness in the past, and certainly do a good deal of forensic work, much of which, for better or for worse, ends up in the courts. Right, so. That said, what we're looking at here effectively is a basically a suit filed by the Norfolk Truck Center, and they basically were insured by the Cincinnati Insurance Company. And what effectively occurred was, very much like any number of other incidents, and we work a ton of these cases where there's fraud involved, right? And the fraud here specifically involved an email message, right? And the email message itself basically came in and said, actually, I'll start a little bit before that. The Norfolk Truck Center orders two mixing trucks, cement mixing trucks, and ultimately then receives an email shortly thereafter from the basically, or purporting to be from the company they had ordered the trucks from. And it turns out that it really wasn't. Unsurprisingly, we've seen this before. We've been down this road, and turns out that it was actually from an attacker who had purchased a lookalike domain. Again, we're going to walk through some of the specifics. Just want to get like the high level piece here. And ultimately, the email, like so many others that we've seen before, said, hey, oh my gosh, we're having a problem with our bank, and for the moment, hold off on that wire transfer. We're going to send you new banking information once we screw all this up. And then, like so many of these that we've seen in the past, actually is like, and I'm so embarrassed, apologizing for the whole, confusion. It's so embarrassing as a business, etc. We see this all the time. This is the kind of stuff, by the way, that has to go into your user awareness education, because look, again, wow, so often we see just these horrible test phishing campaigns or phishing test campaigns, right, where folks send like ridiculously bad stuff out there. And I say bad meaning like the every fourth word is misspelled. The deposed king of Nigeria super wants your help. And look, I'm all about empowering users to make sure that they don't lose money, but I'm going to be straight up and say, look, that the 419 scam kind of thing, the advanced fee fraud, that's the kind of thing largely that is not impacting businesses. It's largely impacting individuals. And while I care about keeping the individual safe, I truly do. I care much more about when I'm looking at spending business resources or devoting business resources to a problem. I want to devote those resources to keeping the business safe first and foremost, and then I'll worry about the user secondarily. Now, good news, this is one of these great spots where that overlaps quite a bit. Do the right thing for you does the right thing for the business, right? Or doing the right thing for the business very often does the right thing for the user. That said, we have to train against what the reality is that users are seeing in the field, right? And very often we do not. Anyway, TLDR, you know how the story ends. If there's a lawsuit involved, the Norfolk Truck Center sent or fraudulently, well, they didn't fraudulently send, they sent funds to a fraudulent bank account. And now the case picks up because what really happens here effectively is that the basically the insurance company said, well, that's not really our problem, right? You do have cyber insurance, but this doesn't really cover. It wasn't a hack per se. The cyber insurance explicitly says that the loss must come directly from a computer, directly from fraud on the computer. Now, this was designed to insulate around things like malware, not necessarily insure against this case of social engineering. And so that's really where we kind of start the whole argument is about, is this a direct loss from a computer event? Now, I could argue this either way, and it turns out I'm positive that I'm going to get people in comments and or on Twitter tomorrow as this video releases in the morning that are going to say things like, oh my gosh, yeah, it is or isn't a direct loss. Look, at the end of the day, I could argue it either way, and you know what? It doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, all that matters is what the courts say, right? And it's important for us to understand this because a lot of folks really are gravitating to cyber insurance as a risk mitigation strategy, right? Now, that there's probably a whole nother topic to discuss there. What does risk mitigation mean in this context? But let's walk through the case here, because you're going to hear, if you haven't yet, you're going to hear executives say, hey, you know what? We can totally buy cyber insurance to protect against this loss. And that may not be true. It may have been true some years ago. And let me say that by all means, buy cyber insurance and it may protect you against the loss. But increasingly, we're seeing cyber insurance companies look and go, you know, we're not covering that. Or at least we're going to go test the waters around some of these cases. And here, sure enough, Cincinnati Insurance did certainly test the waters around this case. Now, around the situation here. Now, I want to come up here and note first off that the company in question that the purchase is made from is called Kimball Mixer, right? So that's going to become critical here in a minute when you see the domains that were registered. Ultimately, the loss here is $333,000 that the imposter was wired. The imposter being the criminal, the cyber criminal. Now, the insurance only covers $250,000, but certainly having to eat $330,000 versus what does it work out to, $83,000? No brainer there. Obviously, you paid your insurance premiums. You thought you were going to be covered. You want to be covered. Important side note on cyber insurance, by the way, certainly check what is and isn't covered. A lot of people go in and buy cyber insurance and they feel like it's buying automobile insurance. You buy automobile insurance for your personal car. I mean, let's be fair, right? You're covered whether you hit a deer. You're covered whether you hit the deer on Thursday or Friday. Generally, you're covered even when some other driver hits you. You're covered for random crazy stuff because it's in the car, right? And that's what a lot of people think about when they, by the way, if you're a lawyer and you're listening to this and you're going, no, that's ridiculous, there's all kinds of exclusions. I get it. But your average person understands that absent weirdness, right? That generally anything that happens in the car is going to be covered. And cyber insurance is not always like that, right? A lot of people are like, well, if it happens, if you can tie cyber to it somehow, cyber insurance is going to cover. And that's absolutely not always the case. And again, we're seeing more and more questions here around, or more and more challenges around cyber insurance in general. Okay, so obviously, again, we know how the story ends. Basically, the folks were sent the criminal was sent $333,000, right? Now, again, critical here, loss of money, the policy states that it will pay for loss of money resulting directly from the use of any computer to fraudulently cause a transfer of that property from inside the premises or banking premises to a person, right, outside those premises. Now, as a basically as a fact of law, nobody challenged, right? Both parties agreed to practically everything around definitions, except what did directly mean in this case, right? Because remember, right, this isn't a pure computer case. This isn't malware intercepting credentials and then using those, right, to ultimately cause the transfer. This is purely trickery. That again, we see this a lot, but purely trickery. And here the insurance company is challenging this. Okay, so by the way, too, note that if you get stuck in one of these scenarios, this can take some time to play out here. Let me find the original date here. I believe it was 2017. They sent basically sent the money, but ultimately here, a case was filed in 2018. I believe the loss occurs mid-year 2017, and if you noted the date on the report here, basically, or the court filing wasn't until December 20th of 2019, right? So you're looking at 2+ years. 2+ years for this to all play out, right? So I'm going to scroll through quite a bit of this because a lot of it just doesn't matter here. So I say doesn't matter. It absolutely matters, but I'm not as interested. Around this. Again, here we note on or about December 22nd, 2016, Kimball Mixer sends basically a email with invoices, basically for the city of Hampton. Okay, great, got the truck invoices here. Notice this email, though. This is critical here. at kimballmixer.com, right? Kimballmixer.com. Now, I'm going to tell you that as a red teamer, somebody that does a lot of phishing, heck, somebody does a lot of incident response, take your pick. Red or blue, doesn't matter. You're going to recognize, you're going to look at Kimball Mixer and go, yep. Outstanding, right? And one of the reasons for that is that there's an L there, right? L's are easily transposed for ones, and I'll also mention that LEs, particularly L's and E's, right? That diphthong there is interchangeable with EL, right? So it is kind of interesting to me. L's, by the way, too, are very easy to drop, and people just miss the fact that they're dropped, right? So KimballMixer.com is asking for lookalike domains. If you have a domain like this, you should definitely get some domain reputation services tied up around that because wow, right? But again, lfarrow at kimballmixer.com. Okay, so we scroll on down a little bit further, and basically, as you roll forward a little bit further here, notice here, and I said it was early to mid 2017. It was December 2016, excuse me. So this took almost 3 years to play out, and between the time that the claim was submitted and the time, between the time of the criminal act and the time that ultimately these folks, this insurance company, has been ordered to pay the insured. I want you to think about for a moment too, by the way, when you, even if you're not a lawyer, rock on. Again, I'm not offering legal advice, I'm not offering insurance advice, but if you're a cybersecurity professional or a risk management professional who is working with management, trying to explain what is the risk, right? What risks do we still have with cyber insurance? I am positive that when basically when this cyber insurance policy for $250,000 was purchased, that there was an expectation that covered losses would be covered in a timely manner, and I don't think anybody would say that 3 years meets that expectation, right? 3 years from the time of loss meets that expectation. So granted, again, not everything goes to legal. I totally get that, but I would use this, and not just will be using this as a case study with our clients. Now, this is not a FUD thing, a fear, uncertainty, and doubt kind of thing. I just want to make sure that we are educating folks appropriately. That's part of the reason we do these series here, but also that we're educating folks appropriately at managerial levels who believe that buying this insurance is a full risk mitigation strategy. It's a risk transference strategy, not really mitigation. You're mitigating against a covered loss, but even here, eventually against a covered loss. Okay, so notice here then that the attacker then registers the domain Kimball's, right? So kimballsmixer.com, right? So adds an S and then drops the L on the Farrow. Now, I don't know whether or not that was intentional, right? Because it was L Farrow at Kimball Mixer. Here they've added an S in the middle there, and again, that wasn't caught by the victim, right? And unsurprisingly, I got to tell you, this is the kind of thing we see again and again and again. By the way, we're not necessarily going to cover the specific part in here where it talks about this, but indeed, doing some forensics, they discovered that indeed whoever registered this domain has registered lots of other lookalike domains or typo squat domains, however you want to word those. This is not a one-off fraudster. This appears to be more of a determined adversary. Now, that doesn't really play in as a matter of law, but done, right? Notice here, and by the way too, if you are using phishing campaigns, if you're doing phishing campaigns in your organization, for goodness sakes, make them realistic. And I'm going to tell you, this shows up again and again and again in these wire transfer fraud scenarios. I sincerely apologize for this embarrassing situation. They're playing on human emotion here, right? First off, they're saying, hey, I have to hold off on the wire director, right? So there's a call to action, but there's also a note, right? Also a note of the vulnerability, like that, man, I'm so sorry, this is embarrassing for us, and all that, right? So, okay. So that email gets sent, and then sure enough, what are the odds? They say, hey, we got it cleared up, right? So we're looking at basically at 8:42, they sent the email, and then not an hour later, they're like, hey, we've got it all cleared up, and game on, and rock on, move forward, right? Now, one could argue, 9:41 p.m., like that's getting a little bit late, and were banks open then, and hey, whatever, rock on. I mean, if it was a West Coast versus East Coast and timing and whatever, bottom line, effectively here now they have new bank transfer instructions, and again, we know how this plays out, right? So I'm going to kind of skip ahead through a chunk of this, but by all means, go download it and read it. It's legal documents, and of course, they all read like stereo instructions, right? This is the important part for me, paragraph 38, right? So specifically here in paragraph 38, they note that forensic analysis of Norfolk Truck's computer system found no active malware or malicious programs or documents involved in the initiation, authorization, or execution of the wire transfer, right? And there's where I got the August 31st, whatever, wire transfer, or the 2017 piece, right? No credential stealing malware that will allow for confidential information to be obtained was involved in the wire transfer either. And it's critical to note that both parties agree that this is the case, right? Now this, by the way, I probably should have started out by noting that this was done as a summary trial. So basically, there was no jury involved. I say summary trial, excuse me, a bench trial. No jury was involved here. Anyway, I said summary earlier. Both parties repeatedly asked for summary judgment in their favor, of course, without it going to trial. But the demand for a jury trial was dropped, right? So the judge alone decided on the findings of fact, the findings of law. Basically here, because there was no argument about what is fact in this case, that made it more appealing for both parties to basically to forego a jury. Juries, for whatever it's worth, look, if you did jury duty, right, my hat's off to you. Good job. You don't get a jury of your peers in the U.S. It's just the reality. I know that's what it says. I know that's what we're guaranteed, right? The reality is you get a jury of 12 people who think jury duty sounds like a good idea, right? Who can't figure out how to get out of jury duty or tried and failed to get out of jury duty. They're not always the most motivated people. They're not always the smartest people. And again, if you're doing your civic duty, please, thank you from the bottom of my heart. What I'm going to say is that in this case, I suspect both parties agreed to avoid a jury trial once they agreed on findings of fact, specifically because they knew effectively that emotion on, again, it's civil trial, so it's a pure majority, and emotion could have played into that and could have negatively impacted either side in an unpredictable manner, right? Whereas the judge, you might argue, would be a more rational actor, right? And so anyway, just want to give you a little bit of background there, because again, we do a little bit of that work here and there. Again, I'm not the lawyer. Anyway, TLDR, all that, right? So the policy, again, the specific issue here is the loss direct if social engineering played a part here? It turns out there's case law that says it's not direct if social engineering plays a part, but only in specific conditions, right? And so I'm going to move down here a little bit further and find some, or basically walk through a couple of cases here. The judge ultimately looks and says, look, here the Fifth Circuit found that a fraudulent scheme was not covered by a similar computer fraud insurance provision, right? Now here, the victim received a phone call from the imposter and the criminal, right, the fraudster, and the fraudster claimed that they were a vendor, and basically this was vishing, right? So vishing, voice phishing, right, as opposed to actual email phishing. Now it turns out that there actually was an email sent from a lookalike domain, a Typo Squad domain in this Apache case, and so the Apache Corp case. But what's really interesting here is that even though the email was sent, right, the phone call, the email was secondary to the fraud, right? Meaning the email was supposed to be a verification step, and ultimately ended up the court ruled basically that the email that followed up with the wire transfer instructions on their letterhead, right? Their letterhead was secondary to the actual fraud. It wasn't the actual, or wasn't core to the fraud itself. Now, I can argue all day long here. It doesn't really matter what my opinion is. It matters what the court's opinion is, because that becomes precedent, right? And so ultimately what we have here effectively is, and by the way too, this is another great educational case, because I will tell you that of executives, this is a case that I've talked to executives about in the past. I walk them through some baseline facts of the case, say, look, hey, got a phone call, an employee gets a phone call and they're told, hey, don't pay that invoice yet, we've got to change bank routing information, here's our new bank routing info. And the employee says, no, I can't take this over the phone, you need to follow up with an email on your letterhead. Or mail, email, I need something on your letterhead that shows that change. And then they follow up with it over email, and then they go ahead and initiate the transfer. And I've had executive after executive tell me, oh yeah, there's no question that would be covered by cyber insurance. Well, I have bad news for you, right? Because in this case, with a policy written this way, if that vishing and that other fraud is not covered, wouldn't be covered under cyber insurance. It may be covered under some other insurance provision, right? But from a cyber insurance perspective, even though the computer was involved in the crime, it's not a covered loss, right? And this is absolutely critical to know. I say critical to know. If you're advising around risk, if you see somebody say, don't worry, we'll just buy cyber insurance, and it's not the punchline to a joke, right? By all means, buy cyber insurance, use it, but again, understand what it covers and what it doesn't, right? Anyway, look, basically here it was the court ruled merely incidental to the occurrence of the what should have been an authorized transfer of money, right? And so basically here, if the email had been the original conveyance, the court kind of opened up and said, look, if the email had been the conveyance, if that had been the trickery, if the phone call hadn't happened, if the phone call had initiated this, then it would have been a covered loss. But here it's not, even though an email came in, right? So, okay. Another case that we want to take a look at here, interactive communications. Now here, this again involves a phone, but the phone is actually not the important part. Interactive communications sells some of these cards. Basically here, you would go and reload a basic consumer debit card, right? So if you've ever added credit to a card, prepaid debit or whatever, you know, like you do you get the gift receipt and it's got like a code and you call. I've done this for prepaid cell service in other countries and you name it, whatever. Bottom line, you call up and you enter a number and it's usually an obscenely long number and of course you mistype it 4 times and then right then they go ahead and credit your account. Sure enough here, they processed more than 23,000 fraudulent redemptions, right? And so ultimately here, that is not ideal in their case, and they submitted some number of those as basically as a claim for insurance fraud. Now the key here, and this also was not a covered loss. The key here is that the computer was secondary, right? That the court ultimately determined here that even though a computer was used in the attack, meaning that basically there was some time of check, time of use vulnerability, but here basically they were doing duplicate redemptions, right? Again, time of check, time of use, but basically here the computer was secondary to the crime. The computer was used to go offload or cash out there. It wasn't used basically to commit the fraud originally, right? So it was cashing out after the fact, not the actual conveyance of the crime, as it were. The court, again, in this case, and I don't have that pulled up here, but the court in that case basically insinuated that if indeed the company Interactive Communications had been hacked and the same loss had occurred through a hack on their system, then the cyber insurance would have picked up, but here not so much, right? So. Certainly here we have other scenarios. Here's one where the court found basically found against the insurance company. It's insurance you must pay. Basically here there was one in Medidata. Basically the fraudster used code to spoof emails and they initiated wire transfers, fraudulent transfers. And here again, notice here the Second Circuit notes here the fraudulent emails basically initiated the chain of events that led to the fraud, right? Even though there were external actions necessary to cause a loss of money, right? Now, they talk about a causal link here. A lot of people misread that as casual, lawyers on positive or not, but causal link meaning does one thing cause the other? Are these linked together? And again, clearly here, even though there's a external action required and somebody has to be tricked, this is exactly the scenario or within, it's pretty tightly the scenario that Norfolk finds themselves in, right? As they order these trucks, right? And so again, we walk through a couple of scenarios there, or the court walks through a couple of scenarios there, and so. Perfect, right? So not going to walk through the defendant's arguments here because the reality is here that they kind of argued very well for sanity and kind of noted about. And again, I won't walk through here, but I will mention here that the court found directly, the word directly. Remember, that's what was at issue here. Is what is the definition of that word? Said, look, it has a very, very plain and ordinary meaning. And it's clear to us, or it's clear to the court, that basically that absent that email, right, and if that email had not come in, and there was no external anything that played into that, right, the email came in, the user was tricked, and the user initiated a fraudulent wire transfer as a result, right? Now, these have been happening a lot. I can't tell you how many of these we worked last year. One, because I don't have the number available immediately, and two, because I'm not going into that anyway, because we don't talk about our clients unless they say, hey, let's talk. And generally, people that lose money like this don't want to talk about that. Right? I totally get that. Right? But okay. So when you get into these email fraud kind of schemes, I'll make a bold prediction here. Actually, I don't think it's that bold. I'm going to say that I think that the language around these policies is going to get significantly tighter. And I think if you're counting 100% on, hey, don't worry, we're going to be covered, I think it's time to really step back and take a hard look at that and walk through some scenarios, right? A scenario that's not covered here, right? Now, we talked about Apache Corp, where the phone message started the fraud, but the fraud was then confirmed through email. What they didn't talk about here, and what I don't have good case law around, I know there's some case law out there, by the way, before lawyers start throwing it at me. I don't have any right at the tip of, kind of tip of the spear here. And the case law that's out there, the scenarios have been a little bit convoluted as it were, but it's what happens when the email comes in first, and then there's a telephonic verification, right? Telephonic fraud that occurs after the fact, right? I don't have any clear guidance, clear anything on that, any guidance, nothing. I wouldn't give you guidance because I'm not a lawyer. That said, again, this is the kind of stuff that you should be following if you're a cybersecurity professional, because this is going to come up again, if not in your casework directly, it's going to come up as you brief executives, as you talk to other other leadership, because a lot of folks are just like, oh yeah, we'll just insure against that risk. Well, I'll tell you, I have a rule about the word just. Anytime somebody uses the word just to talk about cybersecurity, I will tell you that the vast majority, I said anytime, I'm going to go with the vast majority of the time, they've oversimplified the problem. And I can tell that just from the use of the word just. Anyway, so I think that's where I'm going to go ahead and close it off here. I will come down and note here that that basically the court basically came back and said, hey, you are going to need to go ahead and pay that $250,000, and interest is going to accrue basically from the time that either the claim was filed or the original judgment was filed. Anyway, bottom line, here you are. Again, cyber insurance loses in this case. I just cannot fathom that they have not already, long before that this was decided, that they haven't tightened up the language in the policies, and they are going to continue to do so. Cyber insurance companies are getting raked across the coals. The actuarial tables were not well understood. It was a new product, right? And they didn't know how much they were going to be paying out. I can tell you from talking to some insurance professionals that they have paid out far more than they expected to on some of these policies. Some of them referred to some folks I've talked to have referred to early cyber insurance policies as, quote, pure gambles. And hey, rock on. You are gambling. We don't have good actuarial tables, right? So now they do, right? And as time moves on, they're getting better and better. And we can only expect that the number of things that are going to be covered losses are going to decrease dramatically. It will not surprise me if later down the road folks are asked to, and again, this wasn't even an issue in this case, so it didn't come up. What kind of user awareness training are you providing, right? Was this user, let's say you do user awareness training, right? What type of user awareness training are you doing? Do you simulate this fish, right? Could somebody argue that down the road, if you haven't simulated this specific fish or something very similar to it, saying, hey, pause on that wire transfer because it's very embarrassing, but we've got, again, this is now a matter of law. You could argue from a due diligence standpoint. I'm not saying that any of this would hold up legally. I'm just saying, like, you've got to think about, down the road, what are we likely to have to deal with to protect our organizations, both from cyber insurance loss as well as financial loss, right? Anyway, that's where I'm going to go ahead and close it off here. I'm going to go ahead and drop a link to the drop a link to the judgment here in the YouTube video comments, and certainly, again, use this as a case study because a lot of folks again are just have their heads buried in the sand about, well, cyber insurance is going to cover us, and again, this is a case where everything happened to work out, but just barely, right? And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway here, is that there was a reasonable expectation, or reasonable, that's probably nothing. That is a legal term. There was an expectation by the city of Norfolk that by buying insurance, cyber insurance, they would be protected against losses involving cybersecurity. They then believed that this loss did involve cybersecurity. The court happens to agree in this case, but the cyber insurance company tried to argue against that, and I mean, again, not entirely wrong, I guess. I can see the arguments on both sides. At the end of the day, matter of law, done. But alas, wanted to make you aware of this so that you can bring this to your organizations as well. Anyway, enough with that. Jake Williams from Edition InfoSec, signing off.